Episode 17, Never Forsaken Podcast. Today I'll be talking with Sarah Griffith Lund. Sarah is a pastor and an author of a book called Blessed Are the Crazy, Breaking the Silence About Mental Illness, Family, and Church. Really enjoyed talking with Sarah. Sarah's got a lot of knowledge about mental health issues. Just reading from the back of her book, Sarah Griffith Lund takes the lid off mental illness in this raw, honest look at her father's battle with bipolar disorder, the helpless sense of deja vu as her brother struggles with his own mental illness, and serving as spiritual advisor for her cousin, a mentally ill man executed for murder. Through the challenges and despair, she shows how churches can be safe havens for people who have brain diseases and for their loved ones. I actually did read this book. I think this book is wonderful, and I recommend you pick it up. I'll have all the links on neverforsakenpodcast.com and on the Facebook page. Sarah gets into a lot of personal issues, personal struggles, and her own reality regarding mental illness in her family. Reason I wanted to put this one out before Christmas is that I think around the holiday season, a lot of us will tend to deal with other family members who actually may have mental health issues. Sarah says basically that 50% of Americans will deal with a mental health issue at some point in their life. So holidays is just a great time to kind of talk about this and bring some awareness and some enlightenment into the church about this topic. Hey everybody, you're listening to the Never Forsaken Podcast, looking at the lives of the outcasts, the seekers, the never forsakens, those in or out of their local church and passionate about Christ. The show is broadcast weekly, and show notes and more information can be found at neverforsakenpodcast.com. I'm your host, John Robinson. Let's get into the show. Thank you, podcast listeners, for tuning in to another episode of the Never Forsaken Podcast. My guest today is Sarah Griffith Lund, and Sarah is the author of a book called Blessed Are the Crazy. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to be on the show.
Well, I appreciate it a lot, Sarah. I think this is a topic that, as you can agree with, is definitely not discussed in the church all that much.
Yeah, I mean, when I, realized how hungry people are for the conversation, I think it's exactly that. We haven't been talking about mental illness, even though research shows that 1 out of every 5 of us will have some kind of mental illness in a given year. And in our lifetime, half of us will have a mental illness. Even though it's so common and everyone has, a family member or a neighbor or someone you work with who has a mental illness, we just don't talk about it. And I think the reason we don't talk about it is because of that shame and stigma. We think that it's a problem that we have to figure out on our own, that maybe it's a moral weakness or a character flaw. In some churches, there's even a belief that mental illness, especially around depression and anxiety, that it's caused by a spiritual defect, like a sin almost. So there's a lot of myths running around that really need to be eradicated, from our Christian thinking. And one of those is that this belief that mental illness is a spiritual disease caused by demons. That's still a belief a lot of people have. And while I think there's certainly spiritual causes to forms of mental illness, more and more we know the research shows that mental illness is related to our brains, and it's part of our brain health. And some brains, like some people's hearts, are more prone to diseases, and mental illness is a disease. So, there's churches and pastors who teach that you shouldn't take medication, that prayer and Bible study can cure people of mental illness. And so, people have stopped taking their meds because their pastor told them to, and they just get worse, and they might, lead to a suicide attempt.
Right.
And so that's really scary. So what we're hoping is that the more we talk about it, the safer it is for people to share their struggles, and people can get support and compassion and not feel like they're being judged.
Sarah, I think that's a great overview, and you actually touched a little bit on just about every single question that I was going to ask. So I think it's good. We'll get to kind of go back into some of these in a little bit more detail. Well, let me ask you this question. One of the things, you gave me the statistics at the beginning, 1 in 5 that struggle with some type of mental health issue, and eventually half, 50%, is that right?
Yes, yeah. According to NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, those are the most recent statistics that, in our lifetime, so from birth to death, half of us in the United States will have some kind of diagnosable mental illness. And of course, as people live longer, now there's more age-related types of, dementia and other forms of brain diseases.
So why are these numbers so high? Because that seemed I had no idea that it was that high. But why are these numbers so high? And is it an American problem versus a world, rest of the world problem, or are things not diagnosed in the rest of the world? Could you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, so that's always a great question. Now that we're researching and documenting, we have statistics. So there's always that question of, is there increased rates now, or is this really the first time we're doing the research and finding the numbers? Then there's people who look at the Western society and our culture and the high level of stress related to our capitalism and our economy, that we have two parents in the home working to make ends meet and then raising children. I share that because a couple of years ago I was in South Korea, in Busan, for the World Council of Churches, and I had some really powerful conversations with Koreans around mental health. And what one woman shared, she's a doctor, and I met her at church on Sunday in Seoul. She said that the rates of suicides have skyrocketed in South Korea over the past 5 years.
Wow.
And in her understanding, it's because of their economy that is so based on production, and people's work days, are super long. It's a very competitive economy there, and it's just creating these impossible demands and just a lot of psychic stress. And so I believe South Korea has one of the highest suicide rates in the world. So I think there's something about our society and the additional stresses that come in the postmodern age in the 21st century. So, the brain still has a lot to be researched and a lot more to learn about all the things that are impacting our brain health.
Well, that's what I was going to say. My understanding is that we don't know that much about the brain. We don't know that much about the capabilities of the brain. And so is it kind of correlate as the more that we study about the brain, do we find an increase in mental illness of things that perhaps we didn't really identify before because we as a society or doctors in general were just not as educated or knowledgeable about it?
Well, that's such a great question. I think we see in the diagnostic manual, the DSM, that looks at different mental disorders, things that in the past were called a mental illness. We kind of changed the definition, and I'll just give one quick example. In our country, we've seen the sweeping and the quick change around how we view human sexuality. So at one point, homosexuality was connected to a mental illness, and people could be diagnosed with that. Well, that sounds kind of ridiculous to us today. So we've come a long ways in understanding, what is normal, what is healthy. And as society changes, we kind of change our understandings of that.
Okay, so for yourself, and you're a pastor, I understand.
Yes, yeah, I've been ordained since 2002 in the Christian church, and I've served churches for 10 years, and I served regionally as an associate conference minister, and now I serve at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis.
So did your interest in research and writing about the issue of mental health, did that start prior to becoming pastor, or is it something that you saw as a result of there being a need for it?
Well, the story really comes from the question that Anna Carter Florence, who is a preaching professor, she met with me and a bunch of young clergy women in the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. for a conference. And she said to us, each of us have a God story. We each have a testimony that we can give. And she challenged us not only to, read the Bible and see the testimonies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Paul, and the other disciples, but what would we say about the God that we've experienced? And when she asked me that, my dad had just died. I literally just came from my dad's funeral. And so
Wow.
my dad died, and his entire adult life, he struggled with severe mental illness. And he was a very successful businessman, so he was able to, still function. But at a certain point, his level of functioning really decreased, and his mental illness had a tremendous impact on me. But I'd always kept it a secret because I was ashamed and embarrassed.
Mm-hmm.
He eventually became homeless, and he had hallucinations. He had delusions. He had some schizophrenia. He heard voices. He thought people were after him, like communist plots. And so I kept all of that a secret. And so when he died suddenly, when I was serving a local church, I told my church members I had to miss Sunday because I needed to travel for my dad's funeral. They were shocked because I never told them, about all of his health problems, that he had been homeless, that he was severely mentally ill. And so really this invitation for me to give my testimony, what is the God story in my life? Really at the heart of that is how God was present in my life, even in the midst of these real critical struggles in my family around mental illness that we were keeping a secret.
Well, and there's such this stigma with mental illness because right away, if you other than some really generally accepted things like depression, for example, it seems there's so many that struggle with it. So if you say, well, I struggle with depression, to some degree, I think people can understand that, but they do also expect people to get over depression like really quickly. Mm-hmm. And so some of this is personal journey for me as well. And I won't get into too much of the story, but like I've been told, like even in my family we come from like long line of mental illness as well. And so I've never particularly like saw any diagnosis, but I do know something's not right with me. So for basically most of my life, but some of the ways it manifests, it seems like severe depression, sometimes anxiety or irrational behavior. And where it's been hard for me in the last 20 years of born again Christian life is I've become very withdrawn from the church world as a whole. And it's one of the reasons I started the podcast, because it's easier for me to kind of reach people on this level. But anyway, that being said, because there's such a stigma and it can be hard for people to function on the church level with mental illness, what happens when the person who's struggling is a pastor or a church leader? What does that person do when they really need mental health? Because if you're looking, like let's say you're the pastor and you struggle with eating a little bit too much, well, people, they may say that's a sin, but they're going to kind of look on you a little bit more favorably than if you're a pastor who drinks too much. Yeah. So where's the help for the pastor in that case? What should they do?
Well, thank you, first of all, for being vulnerable here and sharing, part of your journey. I think that's so powerful, your witness. And clearly, you have tremendous gifts, and what you're doing here is a ministry. And so that just points out to the fact that a lot of people who have some kind of mental health challenge are incredibly gifted, spiritually, intellectually, creative, smart. And so basically the church needs those people. The church needs people who are called to ministry, who are gifted and talented. And the fact that you may have a mental health challenge, that should not be a barrier. However, like you said, there's a lot of stigma and shame, and I find myself talking to a lot of clergy who are really afraid that if their congregation knew, for example, one woman who has bipolar disorder, she has not disclosed that to her church because she's afraid of what they will say. Will they be critical of her, judgmental of her? Will they try to get rid of her? And so
that could cost her job.
That's what she's afraid of. And unfortunately, in most of our authorization systems, we have no way to guarantee that it won't. And so I'm in some conversations with different denominations to look at how do we authorize people for ministry, how do we prepare people for ministry, and how open are we in talking with potential clergy about mental health and about their own mental health history and how to preserve their mental health when they're in ministry. I also have talked to members in discernment, or people who are in seminary who are afraid of disclosing their mental health history because they don't know if the church will accept them. Whether that was, being hospitalized in high school for an eating disorder or, having had a psychotic episode, having bipolar disorder. So the truth is that, clergy are human too, and if 1 in 4, 1 in 5 people in general will have a mental illness, well, we know that applies to clergy. In fact, some could argue that clergy are even more at risk for mental illness.
With the stress,
you
mentioned the stress, and they work tremendous hours and a lot of pressure.
Yeah, I've seen some research that shows that something like 60% of clergy have reported feelings of depression, and the United Methodists have kept records of what is the medication most highly prescribed to clergy, and it's antidepressants.
Well, maybe I'd be a good pastor. I might fit right in.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this, Sarah. Is it something then that's being talked about in seminary?
I guess it depends on the seminary. I know that, as clergy, we're trained often in the basics of pastoral care, and that's also a real kind of gray zone, how well trained are clergy to provide mental health counseling. When do clergy refer, kind of set their own limits on how much care they can provide and have a good list of resources to refer parishioners out. But I don't think currently seminaries do a whole lot around the pastor as self, and mental health. I know at Christian Theological Seminary we do have 2 graduate degrees, one in clinical mental health counseling and one in marriage and family. And so our students who are dual major, Master of Divinity, mental health counseling, they get that deep dive training. But that's not, across the board.
Okay, well, see, now you're in a denomination, but now with my background, I was born again into a church that was not of a denomination, and the pastor did not have seminary training,
okay.
did not have a Bible degree. Mm-hmm. So I think that can even be a little bit more dangerous in many ways.
Well, that is an interesting point. That's, what do you think in terms of the openness would be, for non-denominational pastors who haven't, gone to seminary? I wonder if there's an expressed, desire to have some training around mental health.
I don't know.
I know that Rick Warren and Kay Warren at Saddleback, they've really started a movement to have this conversation in the churches, more evangelical churches, after their son 2 years ago died from suicide. So I believe this spring they're organizing like the 3rd gathering in response to that.
Well, that's good. If there's steps being made towards that, then I think that's great. But I never had any experience with any of that kind of training or anything. But what I used to hear all the time was, like you mentioned earlier, that it was either some type of demonic activity, spiritual weakness in my life or something. And the mindset was always, here I am, 23 years old, go to an altar call because I feel, that need for salvation. And it, so you leave, but still something doesn't feel right. And repeatedly all you hear is, well, Jesus came to make you whole. You just need Jesus. You don't need a counselor. You don't need any of this. So I think I was still experiencing mental issues, and I would just get more down on myself. Like, I think there's a disconnect with me somewhere. Like, I'm not praying enough. I'm not fasting enough. I'm not singing loud enough. I don't know. I'm not worshiping enough. And so I think that's where the problem you come into with some of those churches. So how do you address that Jesus-only mindset, which I think a lot of times might be preached that, well, you just need Jesus, and Jesus is the great physician. He's the healer. He's the one that can make you whole.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I also come from an evangelical, kind of born-again background. In college, I had a really positive experience with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and had a very powerful, kind of recommitted my life to Christ. And so for me, that was definitely about healing, spiritual, emotional healing. So there's truth to that. And I think that's why it's so powerful, because yes, a relationship with God through Jesus Christ is transformative. And so we can't ever water that down. What we can do is add to that in the holistic sense of what it means to be well. And our brains are part of that. So it's like, somebody who has a blindness. I don't know how many pastors today are still, preaching that to cure blindness, you have to pray. I think some are. I think
Right.
that's still happening in our churches.
Sure.
But I think a lot of folks have come to see, blindness might be a side effect of some other kind of disease, or, maybe you need to have corrective surgery. If you can't see very well, go get some glasses. So that's kind of a metaphor that I heard a psychiatrist use at a conference last week. You wouldn't say to somebody who's wearing glasses, take off your glasses and leave them at home. Prayer will heal your vision. Don't ever wear your glasses again. We're just going to pray and you'll be able to see again. So like we wouldn't say to someone who's on antidepressants, don't take your pills for your depression. We're going to pray and then you won't be depressed.
Right.
Because like somebody who needs glasses to see because their eyes, are not working properly, someone whose brain isn't working to the full extent needs sometimes medication so that they can think clearly and function.
So do you think that the church is a safe place for the mentally ill?
I hope it is. And that's why I'm doing the work that I feel called to do, is because I believe in our very essence that Jesus calls the church to be a place of love and healing and comfort. That's who we're called to be as Christians. And
Right.
so if we're not safe for people who have mental illness, then something's wrong.
Well, a personal experience with mine, and it's not to speak ill of anyone, but it's just something that happened. But like basically, at was one point I was withdrawing from a church, and I had a conversation with the pastor, and he basically just came out and said, "John, you're too negative. Everything you say on social media is negative, and this, that, and the other thing." And he said, "I have a lot of people come up to me and ask me, what's wrong with John?" And my response, it kind of bothered me, because it's like, well, how come nobody came up to me and asked, why not ask John what's wrong with John? And try to maybe have a conversation instead of asking other people. So that's what, it's one of the reasons why I don't always feel so safe in church. It's hard to step foot into somewhere and pretend to be somebody that you're not.
Exactly.
Yeah. And a lot of mental illness can lead to a lot of other problems as well, where people get into legal troubles, homelessness. I know there's a high percentage of homeless with mental illnesses, and but see, the church is called to help all these types of people. We're called to help the poor and the disenfranchised and the brokenhearted. So, do you feel that the church is in over its head?
Well, I think you hit on a key point when you said, we shouldn't have to hide when we go to church. If anything, church is the one place where we can be authentic. And for me, in my own journey, I found that the need for authenticity was so strong because it was getting in the way of my faithfulness to be who God has called me to be. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that so many people feel like they have to wear a mask when they go to church or hide part of who they are, that is really sad. And you also mentioned something that I've heard other people say is the best thing that we can do when we know that someone we care about has a mental health struggle is we can ask that person directly, how are you doing?
Right.
And we can sit with them and listen to what they say. And then we can follow up and say, well, how can I support you? How can I be praying for you? Because what you shared, people would talk to each other but not talk to you. And I've heard that from other folks, that there's that silence, that's so isolating. I had a friend who put on the prayer request card that she was struggling with thoughts of suicide, and she signed her name, and it was read out loud in worship.
Wow.
So people knew who it was, and they knew what she was going through. And she asked us, she said, how many of you, how many people do you think came up to me right after church?
Well, in a good way or in a bad way?
Anyway, just how many people, came up to her after church? That's what she asked. So what do you think? How many people came up to her?
My guess, probably none.
That's right. No one.
Been there.
And so that type of silence it's spiritual death.
Mm-hmm.
If we are not responding to those in our own flock who are hurting, no wonder we're not making enough of an impact in the world.
Right. Yeah, and I don't mean it to point fingers and to fault the church. And sometimes some of the topics that come up on my podcast, people will say, well, you're against the church. I'm not against the church. I desire very much to be part of one at some point, and I think this is part of also me taking steps back to doing that.
I think what you're doing is you are helping us redefine and reimagine what the church is.
Yeah.
So I would go to say, what you're creating here is a type of community. Mm-hmm. And if Jesus is at the heart of that, well, that's church. I
agree with that. I definitely think that, at this point, I have like this online community, and that's pretty cool. It works for me. Another final thought, too, that you talked a little bit, you started about the demonic activity, and I have experienced some things in that church that where I kind of was in my 20s. They moved in a lot of that deliverance ministry and stuff like that. So I've seen some really, really strange things that I don't know if they're mental illness. I don't know if they're demonic activity. I actually would lean towards saying they were probably demonic activity, like what you see in the movies. I've seen that stuff. So, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? I don't think that science probably doesn't really address demonic activity. I would think that they dismiss it more than anything.
So, the closest I kind of get to talking about that specific thing is in my own experiences with the spiritual realm, and for me, it's been more of the opposite of demonic. It's been, more where I have felt God and God's presence, and where I've, experienced visions, kind of a mysticism.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the positive realm that I've had experience with. And I kind of wonder with my own family history, are these signs of a mental illness? If I'm hearing from God, if I'm having visions, are these delusions? Is this part of a mental illness, or is this part of a spirituality? So if you look at the diagnostic manual, which is how people in the clinical world diagnose mental illness, they speak to this. So basically they say things of a spiritual nature, like hearing voices or having visions, if they are encountered by an individual, then there's a vulnerability that might be, a diagnosable mental illness. But if these are things encountered by a community, and that it's happening with a whole group of people, then that could be considered part of the community's way of experiencing their faith.
That's interesting.
So I say all that to say that if you were part of a congregation that was having these experiences, then and there might have been something going on, with the spiritual realm, versus somebody who's, outside on a sidewalk, kind of screaming because they're being chased by evil spirits.
That's an important distinction, I think. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense, I think. And also to add to that, perhaps a person would have to examine the fruit of it, because I think you could have delusion in a community as well. I mean, you have that with some of your cults. So
especially if you have, the leaders, if the leaders are not healthy and they're teaching certain things and kind of group think, like you said, in a cult, that can really be very harmful.
Boy, I'll tell you, we have a lot to learn as a church. I think what you're doing is great. This book, I've just got it in the mail the other day, so thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
I've looked through it. I've not had a chance to read it because I'm about 6 books deep. That's just kind of how it goes, where I stay to myself. I have a lot of time off work, so I read a lot. But anyway, you get into a lot of good things in the book. I don't want to give away too much of the story. I hope that people will pick up the book and read it. And so if I could just ask for what's one final piece of advice, I guess, what's the best way for someone to get help if they feel that they need it? To
tell someone you love and trust what's going on with you, not to hide it. And then if someone's in a real crisis, there's suicide, prevention. You can Google suicide prevention. There's always 911 if someone is in a real personal crisis. But the number one thing is breaking the silence, to just tell someone what you're really going through, someone that you trust. That's good to talk about it. Yeah, I think a lot of people, they keep to themselves, and that's not going to make a situation any better. And the more you talk about it, the more you'll realize that you're really not alone. So a lot of us are having very similar struggles. I agree. Well, Sarah, I thank you so much for the wisdom that you've shared with the listeners. I think you've got a lot to give us, as far as information on this topic. I think it's great. I'm going to recommend people to get the book. I know it's available on Chalice Press, and I'll put those links up on neverforsakenpodcast.com and on the website and on the Facebook page and whatnot as well. I appreciate you coming on the show. Any final thoughts? Thank you. Can I just close with, my favorite psalm is Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. Sure. And, as people go through life, a lot of times I know for me, I feel like, where's God? This is so hard. It's so awful, this feeling of hopelessness. But the Psalm 23 reminds us that even though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, that God is there. And that's how I think about mental illness. Sometimes it feels like we're in the shadows, but we know that God is there, even in the shadows, and that God will walk us through into the light. That's great scripture. I'm going to put that one up too when I post the podcast. We'll link it, put Psalm 23 up as well. I appreciate that. Great. Thank you so much. Well, Sarah, thanks again. Nice talking to you. No, great talking to you as well, and thanks for the work that you're doing and for bringing this information to light. It's my privilege. Blessings to you and to all of our listeners. All right. Thank you very much. God bless. Thank you. Bye-bye.